with CSIS's Americas program. We appreciate everyone coming on short notice. I really appreciate the panel coming together on short notice. We thought it was very important to convene a constructive conversation about the future of Puerto Rico and also to talk about the emergency response. And we wanted to make sure that it remained in the news and remained in the attention of policymakers. Puerto Rico is part of the United States. Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens. They have carried a very large burden in all of America's wars since World War I. And it's a great part of the United States. I love going. I have many friends from Puerto Rico. And so we had a responsibility, I think, as a country to respond. And I think everyone who we asked to participate understood that, and we're very grateful. I wanted to first ask Governor Fortuny to make a couple of remarks just to kind of kick off this conversation, and then I hope he'll also join the panel, but I wanted him to just help us kind of frame our understanding. We're very fortunate to have Governor Fortuny, former governor of Puerto Rico, former member of Congress. Many policymakers in Washington turn to Governor Fortuny for advice about Puerto Rico, and he's a friend to many of us in this room. So, Governor, why don't you come up and just help make some remarks first and get this started. Thank you. Thanks, Governor.
Thank you, Dan. And I want to thank CSIS and the panel for being here this morning, and especially Brad from the American Red Cross, and what I know what you all are doing. And as I mentioned privately, I met with one of your folks down there this weekend, and they're doing a fantastic job, and it's welcome, and we're all thankful for that. To put this into perspective, and I know that the idea of the panel, as it should, is to look forward and actually learn lessons from what has happened that can be applicable not just to Puerto Rico, but to the rest of the country as well. As Dan mentioned, we've been part of the U.S. for 120 years. We've been American citizens for 100 years, participated in every single war since we became citizens in greater numbers proportionally than any state of the country. And we're proud of that. And oftentimes when there has been catastrophes in other parts of the country, people in the island have responded in the way, and it's overwhelming, the response that we're seeing from non-for-profit organizations, from corporate donors, and so on and so forth. But of course, a lot needs more, is welcome. And there's a lot going on, and the damage is extensive. To put this into perspective, this Irma hit Puerto Rico hard, but it was not a direct hit. But then and as I was mentioning in an earlier discussion, that was a first punch. And then came this direct hit by a major hurricane. It was only 1 mile per hour shy of being a Category 5. In the first 24 hours, it rained in Puerto Rico as much as it did in 3 days in Houston. There's no infrastructure in the world that can handle those two punches. And in the process, we're still 2 weeks out, and the latest numbers that I have is 92% of the island doesn't have power, 55% have no water. Communications are better today than they were at the beginning. This was a major, I would say, technical problem because people could not communicate with each other, including first responders. I believe it's up to somewhere in the 30s in terms of utilization, although it's sketchy depending on where you are at. When you fly into Puerto Rico before the hurricanes, it was a lush green island, beautiful island, really, and weather is perfect all year round. And our people are joyful and truly enjoy life. This weekend when I went down, it was all brown. It's the wind and the sea salt does this to the foliage. But what really struck me was the scars that I saw in everyone I met. They are deep. And people have been hurt like no time before. And that's what scares me, because we don't give up, and we are willing to work hard, and there are many people here that know our island very well. And I'm deeply concerned as to what's going to be happening next. If power doesn't come back soon, and people don't have jobs, and parents can't send their kids to school, that's a concern that I do have, with people just fleeing the island and not coming back. And the other thing that concerns me is those that are ill. On the plane back from San Juan this weekend, a lot of people, and there are a lot of organizations, private sector organizations, that are working to fly up here those that need medical help, because it's a challenge right now in Puerto Rico. So those that are are in chemo or are elderly and or respirators or what have you, many family members are flying them up here. But hopefully this is temporary, and they'll be able to go back. But my concern is especially those up in the mountains and what will happen to them. However, it's time to also think what's the next step and what needs to be done, not just in the case of Puerto Rico, but how can we handle these situations better in the future. And that's why I welcomed when Dan Ronde gave me a call and he wanted to put this together. And then I'm honored to be part of this panel with such a impressive group of individuals. So again, thank you as CSIS, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Governor. I hope and expect this is not going to be our last conversation about Puerto Rico. I really appreciate your presence. I really also want to thank my new friend, Rodrigo Maces Arce, for flying up from Miami, for being here, and I'm very, very grateful to you as well. I'm going to turn the floor over to my friend and colleague, Romina Bandura, to get this kicked off.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for being here. This is a timely, important, and constructive discussion on the future of Puerto Rico, and we're honored to have such a distinguished panel today. I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists and then ask them in the order that you're seated to give 5 minutes of opening remarks, and then I'll open the discussion with a couple of questions. So Brad Kieserman is VP of Disaster Operations and Logistics at the American Cross. We also have Governor Luis Fortuño, the 10th governor of Puerto Rico from 2009-2013. We have Rodrigo Maces. He's the president of the Puerto Rican Manufacturers Association. Then David Lewis is a senior associate of the Americas program here at CSIS. He's also a Puerto Rican and a Puerto Rican expert. And finally, we have Jonathan Hoffman. Jonathan is Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs at the Department of Homeland Security. So let me open the discussion with some opening remarks from Brad. You have 500 people in Puerto Rico currently. Can you tell us a little bit about what's happening, what has been the progress in the reconstruction efforts?
Thank you. Good morning, and first let me just express my empathy and my sympathy, frankly, for everyone who has been impacted by Hurricanes Irma and Maria in the U.S. Virgin Islands and in Puerto Rico. As the governor said, this was a 1-2 punch, and if you want to continue with the boxing analogy, Maria came in and did a lot of damage in Puerto Rico, did devastating damage in 2 islands of USVI, and then Irma came in and did that, and then Maria came back about 14 days later and did the knockout for both USVI and Puerto Rico. And that is not a trite analogy. You have 2 territories of the United States that are basically lying on the mat right now, and we collectively as a community need to help to get them back up off the mat and back up on their feet, and that is a complex undertaking. Romina mentioned that the Red Cross has about 500 people on the ground in Puerto Rico. Let me just say that the Federal Emergency Management Agency has about 17,000 people on the ground in Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Department of Defense has thousands more on the ground in Puerto Rico. The response of the emergency management community in the United States has been, frankly, complete and comprehensive, and that doesn't mean it's a good situation in Puerto Rico, and nobody should expect that. The definition of a catastrophe is when the very thing you're responding to destroys your capability and capacity to respond, and that is what has happened between Hurricanes Irma and Maria. So the situation on the ground in Puerto Rico, as my team reports to us each and every morning, each day it gets a little bit better for some people. There are still many, many folks who remain without power, and based on the understanding that I have of the situation, they will remain without power as part of a permanent power grid for many, many months, if not more, time to come. So there is a clear need to restore power, restore communications, and ensure that everyone on the island has the commodities that they need to continue to sustain. And so that is going to be the major challenge for all of the relief operations, whether they are Commonwealth operations, whether they are municipal operations, whether they are federal operations. The reality of this is we are all going to have to work together as a whole community. There must be unity of mission. There are 9,000 people in shelters, in 160-some shelters today in Puerto Rico that the Commonwealth is running. There are literally hundreds of thousands of people without power every single day, and that number is probably in the millions every single night. Hospitals are challenged to operate because they can't do 24/7 operations because of power generation issues. And so I think what everybody needs to get their arms around is it is an extraordinarily challenging situation at the individual level where people are just trying to remain in their homes, remain on the island, and get their lives back together again. At the level of the household, at the level of the community, at every level, this is a challenging situation. And I'll make I realize this is an open setting, but I'll go ahead and make a personal observation. It is singularly unhelpful for there to be a lot of blame and ego and all of this going on. And as a non-government employee, I feel that I can say that. The government, every government that I have seen involved in this response at every level of government is making a true effort to care for their citizens. The key is bringing everyone together under unity of mission to accomplish that. Just to give one story here, if we've got a minute left to go. I got an email this morning from the Director of Red Cross Relief Operations on the ground. My team is embedded with the Federal Joint Field Office, which is coordinating operations. Our team came across an infant yesterday. The infant was on a ventilator. The ventilator was running out of gasoline to power the generator that was running the ventilator. So my team was in a rental car, because that's how you get around the island right now. We don't have much other way to do this. It was in a fairly remote area, and so they siphoned gas out of the car to put into the generator. They had infant formula that we had gotten, again, commodities brought in by the federal government. So we gave the baby formula. We helped the family with a relief kit. We were able to put gas in the generator, and then we went back and got more gas and brought that gas so they would have a sustained amount of fuel that would get them by for 5 days. So there's a couple of key pieces in this. There are many, many stories like that going on right now, every day in the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. Those just aren't the stories you're hearing. And those life-saving and life-sustaining acts are being carried out by airmen, sailors, Marines, Army folks, FEMA employees, Red Cross volunteers, Southern Baptist volunteers, Save the Children. The list goes on and on of folks who are coming together. And it's also Puerto Ricans helping Puerto Ricans, U.S. Virgin Island residents helping each other. That's happening every day. That's just not getting covered. I have literally 100 stories like that because we go through this process every day. So what I can tell you is there is enormous generosity of spirit. And there is, frankly, unity of mission at the community level to end this response, begin the recovery, and build back Puerto Rico in a way that is more resilient than it is today. But if that's going to happen, I think we all have to be honest about the challenges that we face. And whether those are business challenges, commercial challenges, government challenges, financial challenges, legal challenges. I think Rahm Emanuel said, don't let a good crisis go don't waste a good crisis. We didn't control Mother Nature. We were delivered Hurricanes Irma and Maria. So let's make sure that we at least leverage those horrific, catastrophic events for the benefit of the folks who live on those islands, who are American citizens and are entitled to every single privilege, benefit, and consideration that every American citizen is entitled to. So I want to thank the Governor for his kind remarks about the American Red Cross. We're one of many, many relief organizations in government there to help, and we will continue to work together with all of our partners to alleviate the suffering of those in Puerto Rico. Appreciate the CSIS putting this together, and I will turn the floor back.
Thank you, Brad. You and your team and others are real true heroes. So we thank you for all the hard work you're doing. I want to turn the remarks to Governor. Would you like to add some other points to?
Sure. Very briefly, and I know we have some topics to cover. And should I go into those topics or not yet? No. Not yet. Okay. Well, I'll just say again, Brad has given you, I believe, as good a description of what's really going on the ground as you can get. And what I would say is that we are grateful for what's being done, but a lot more has to be done. And the next phase, and that's why this panel is important. The next phase is also critical here for the for the betterment of the American citizens residing in this territory. So I'll keep it brief.
Rodrigo?
Good morning to all. Yes, excuse me. Good morning to all. First, let me join Governor Fortunio in thanking Brad and all the people that are helping. The reaction from the state government and the federal government has been very good, very fast, and very effective. Second, let me clarify something. The name of the hurricane is not Maria. The name of the hurricane is PREPA, Puerto Rico Power Authority. It's the major energy utility in the U.S. and is basically the problem of many of these situations. We do have supplies, we do have food, maybe twice of what typically we have. We do have gasoline, we do have diesel. We are totally capable of satisfying Puerto Rico's first needs, but we were not ready to lose all the energy. So in the middle of all this, on top of what Governor Fortunio mentioned some minutes ago, we have what I call a technological catastrophe, a techastrophe, okay? All of a sudden, we wake up after Maria, knowing that we was going to, sell some trees and we was going through many pains, but we were prepared for that because we are in the middle of the hurricane scenario, so we are ready to fight all those things. We were not prepared, though, to be out of total communication, okay? And that happened because the lack of power. At the same time, as Brad mentioned, we're not going to have power at any other point in the next maybe 6-7 months, okay? And it's important that you realize that in parallel, we was fighting an economic reconstruction when this happened. And in order to pay a debt, there have to be people in Puerto Rico to develop business and to pay taxes. If that does not happen, there's anything to be paid. That's why President Trump mentioned the wipeout. It's not by accident. It's simple mathematics. From 3.9 population to 3.4, and then don't forget the timing of this particular hurricane, weeks before school. So many of the productive labor force is going to be concerned about their kids. And of course, we are U.S. citizens. So all we need to do is to buy a JetBlue ticket and that's it. And as you know, Governor of Florida has been extremely generous in terms of allowing all kind of help in order to get people in the university, people in schools, people housing. So the easier is, the more people will leave the island. So unless the bondholders put together some kind of urgent solution to this, and unless we, the private sector, work in order to privatize the energy utility, unless we do that fast and we gave the Puerto Rican citizens good news, the island is going to be partially empty of the productive labor force. So just to give you the perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. David, can you turn off the mic?
Gracias. Oh, turn this one up. Gracias, Romina. First of all, Dan, thank you so much. Muchas gracias for really pulling this together on such short notice. Some of you may have been here 3 weeks ago with us when we did a post-Irma review in the Caribbean. And at that point, as Rodrigo mentioned, there was very little about Puerto Rico, but a critical thing we did mention at that session, covering, just to remind us all, Antigua and Barbuda, British Virgin Islands, U.S. Virgin Islands, St. Martin, both Dutch and French. What happened at that point with an hour to 45 minutes transport distance is that the hub for assistance to USVI, BVI, and St. Martin was Puerto Rico. The government and the private sector putting together airlifts and movement. At last count, before Maria, over 500 refugees from those islands, hospital treatment, shelters, food, hotels, the whole thing. Because Puerto Rico wasn't as badly hit, and it was the closest thing before the Feds got into USVI, the Dutch got into St. Martin, the French got into St. Martin, and the British got into the BVI. And actually, one of the pet projects we were working on right before Maria was setting up a structure for Puerto Rico companies to actually be part of the rebuilding and reconstruction effort in those islands. So, you know, as nature is in the Caribbean, irony, now Puerto Rico turns around. I don't think any of those companies, and you'll correct me, Rodrigo, are now in a position to say, let me see how I can go back and help these neighbors because my problem is now at home. So I think it's important to keep it in regional perspective because despite political status, citizenship, and so on, we're all in one geographic neighborhood. I'd just like to mention 5 quick points which I think we can go into the discussion, Romina, and then as Dan, you already promised, and we're going to take you up on it with the Americas program, is make this the first of a variety of issues to focus on. One, the situation on the ground, as Brad mentioned, it's relief, it's then recovery, restructuring, as Rodrigo mentioned, of which the Power Authority is just one. There's a long list of restructuring in terms of the economic situation on the island, the reconstruction itself, and then, of course, making that resilient. And that has a lot to do with weak infrastructure, but also what shocks us all when we see the housing, the level of informal housing in Puerto Rico, which somehow got permitted, got power lines, got direct TV contracts, got telephone contracts, got water. It is amazing. And that is not something that has anything to do with the White House or FEMA. That is local permitting on the island that really needs to be focused on. Second, Rodrigo mentioned, and we don't need to go much into detail, but a 10-year economic recession, which as an economist that I am, I'm losing the fight with my industry that how many quarters of negative growth do we need before we call it a depression? Obviously, it's politics. Puerto Rico is in an economic depression, and it's been in one. It's not a recession anymore, and Paul Krugman and Nobel Prize winners can say whatever they want. That's the situation. And obviously, it's the fiscal debt crisis, and now basically what we're running, a structural adjustment program, just that it's not with the World Bank or the IMF, it's with the U.S. government. And clearly, the hurricane throws this completely into chaos and has to be refocused on. Third, of course, is then the discussion, what's going to be the economic program to rebuild? And as many people are saying, it's not a handout, it's not more loans, it's a package of economic recovery where you build back and better, but it has to be linked with economic policies that stimulate and promote growth. Whether you argue that it ought to be fiscal and tax incentives, whether you argue that it ought to be restructuring the state, which is still the same state we had in the 1950s, all publicly run. That has to be put on the table. Fourth point, not my pet peeve, but I have to be realistic. What does this do to the 120-year dilemma of Puerto Rico's political status relationship with the United States? Statehood, independence, Commonwealth as it is, and that clearly is going to have an impact, particularly at this moment because the governor had a big push on statehood in the U.S. Congress, and clearly he and his party now need to make some questions. Do I continue with that or not? And finally, I think this is something that goes beyond governments. This is a multi-sector effort, private sector, governments, civil society, nonprofits, because the magnitude is just too much. And I think that that's really what part of the essence now, bringing that together, and CSIS has a role to play in that. So thank you.
And just to correct myself, even though the food supply is, in terms of available, is on the ports, inland distribution is very difficult. And if it gets to the supermarkets, then you face the second challenge. Do you have catch? Because now Puerto Rico is on a catch basis. Because of no telecommunications, most of banks are down. So if I was able to get my paycheck, can I change it? No. And if I cannot change it, do I have sufficient cash to buy food, if there is food? Probably the answer is no. So even if I am a good employee or employer, and I am responsible, and I have money in the bank, okay, I may not have sufficient cash in order to help my family if my grocery store have food. Okay?
Thank you, David and Rodrigo. Now I turn to Jonathan for some government perspective introductory remarks.
Sure. Thank you for having me today. I'm here representing the 250,000 people at the Department of Homeland Security and the more than 17,000 federal employees that are deployed to Puerto Rico in support of Hurricane Maria efforts. I would have liked to have one of our operators from FEMA come over today and talk to you. I think that probably would have been more satisfying, but they're a little busy today, and so I offered to come over and try to answer as many questions as possible and try to give you a little perspective on what we've been doing. I think a couple people mentioned it. The most important thing for us is, this has been a uniquely challenging hurricane season. Between Harvey, Irma, Maria, we've had 3 major hurricanes. We're now on 44 days straight of 24/7 operations. I know the American Red Cross is in the same boat we are, with people who've been going nonstop for a while. Our job at FEMA and at the federal government is not to take over. Our job is to support the governor. So I'm sure Governor Fortuna, Governor Rosario, Governor Scott, and Abbott, they're supported by us. They tell us what they want, what they need, and we help them. There's a unity of effort. So everybody goes through one point. So the Red Cross works with FEMA, DOD works with FEMA, the state works with FEMA. So you have a unity of command, a unity of effort. It's been a little frustrating to kind of explain that to some people. I had a conversation with a reporter recently who was saying that the federal government wasn't helping in certain cases. And I said, well, what exactly are you talking about? And they said, well, FEMA's not there because this particular incident, they needed help, and they had the local municipality showed up with supplies. Well, and then DOD came by with some stuff to help, and there was somebody from the Department of Energy, but nobody from FEMA. And I tried to explain that's all one entity. That's all everybody working together. So FEMA is a small organization. I think they only have about 4,000 employees, but their job is to manage and to bring everybody into the loop and to help everybody stay coordinated, and that's what they've been doing. Each disaster is different. Texas, historic flooding. I don't know if any of you have been out there to see what happened in some of those neighborhoods, but just shocking amounts of flooding. Florida was basically a wind event. Governor Fortuna described the trees being denuded. Same thing in Florida, just the wind ripping everything down, knocking power lines down. Puerto Rico and Virgin Islands have been very different. It's been a wind issue as well as a flooding issue. Very different and different challenges. You have the geographic realities of the island and the distance from the mainland. I think we've heard some other people mention the issues with the infrastructure, particularly the power infrastructure, have made it difficult. So each disaster requires a different approach. What was uniquely challenging about Maria, what is uniquely challenging about Maria, as others have mentioned, is the fact that the impact on the first responders, the truck drivers, the power workers, those critical people that normally in a disaster were relied upon to help respond, they became survivors themselves. They became victims of the storm themselves, more so than we've seen in other storms. Therefore, we've been able to get supplies to the island. Supplies were on the island prior to the storm, they were there after the storm, but distributing them has been the challenge. It's getting better. We're doing airdrops, roads are cleared, more trucks, more vehicles, more military personnel are on the island to help do that, but it's been a challenge to rebuild that distribution system. And a lot of people say that last mile. We can get it to a region, but to get it into every little town has been a challenge. We've set up regional areas, people are coming in, picking up supplies, taking them back out to their people in an effort to try to get things out. And I agree, I think that there's people are getting the food, they're getting the water, power still remains an issue. And it's going to take time to rebuild that capacity and get to that point. Water's coming back. The gas and fuel has been distributed. There's 80% of gas stations are now open. If they're open, I've got to imagine the gas stations have fuel if they're open, which is a good step. Medical is an issue. We've been doing assessments of all the hospitals. You have the U.S. Naval Support Ship Comfort is there. We actually had 29 people evacuated to it yesterday. So there's the capacity to help. It's getting the capacity in the right places. Additionally, the communications. Communications, I think you'll see massive improvements in a short time. And this is one of those things where the federal government, we have to work with our private sector partners. We don't run the cell system. We have to work with AT&T and Verizon. What we do is we empower them. So they're bringing in cellular tower on wheels, cellular towers on light trucks, so that they can do pop-up cell service on the island. We help facilitate that by putting them on large Air Force aircraft and flying them down, or putting on barges and bringing them down. Those will be in place later this week, early next week. So the cellular service, the communications capability should come on much more quickly than the power situation. And we look forward, I know everyone looks forward to that, mainly to be able to coordinate, but also so people can talk to their family members and make sure that people are okay. So I'll just conclude. One of the things that we look at, and in Texas, what we would hear from the local officials is, look, we need to get people back in their homes so we can get kids back in school, so we can get football back on Friday night. And so in Puerto Rico, I imagine it's baseball, but we're looking for that sense of community. We want to get people back in their communities. We want people to be back at school. We want people to be back at work. We want people to be able to be back in their communities so that they're able to work with their family members, their friends, be back and get back to a normal life as quickly as possible. That's the goal, and that's what we're working to with everybody. We appreciate the support from the private sector. We appreciate the support from other charities. There are a lot of people working on this, and they're all pulling in the same direction and trying to get the same thing done. There's been challenges, but I think we've turned a corner on that, and things are going to get better. But I appreciate you guys having us here, and I look forward to answering any questions I can.
Many thanks, Jonathan, and thank you for all the description and telling us, what's happening really on the ground and the facts on the ground. I'd like to focus, divide this discussion into two parts. The first part, mainly what we could do better in the U.S. to react to these types of disasters, and how we can prepare better. Maybe we'll take 10-15 minutes to discuss that, but I'm more interested in the long run. What happens next? Does this magnitude of disaster bring a unique opportunity for Puerto Rico to think about deeper structural reforms and preventing that brain drain that was discussed here? So maybe Brad, I don't want to put you on the spot, but what are your thoughts on how we can better prepare for these type of natural events and better react to them?
Okay, good, because the answer varies literally state by state and territory by territory. So one, I think let's begin with looking at a very positive dimension. The Commonwealth opened literally 178 shelters and sheltered well over 30,000 people, and did that in a way that, frankly, I think would challenge most states in the continental United States. I know most people don't think about that, but to have that infrastructure in place, to have a system which Commonwealth employees and municipal employees are able to open shelters, to have the supplies that are necessary, the cots, the blankets, that is not easy. And it is not easy when you're doing it on a 1-2 punch event from 2 hurricanes. So I haven't heard a single word of acknowledgement of the operational success, the readiness of the Commonwealth, the readiness of 178 municipalities to achieve that outcome, which we have been challenged with, frankly, in Florida, in Texas, and other locations. Not a criticism of any of those states. They have excellent emergency management programs. It's just a reality that that's a challenging thing to do. If it was easy, anyone would do it. So I think, one, we need to make sure that that system is reconstituted and is properly supplied. There are 4 dimensions to readiness, preparedness, that I think as we look at the reconstitution of the Commonwealth and we look at the way forward, that we don't want to lose sight of. And you've heard all of them. I'm just going to try to put a framework around it in just a minute or two. So one is, you've got to have the necessary people available to respond to the event. The one thing you can never get back in a disaster is time, and the one challenge to responding in Puerto Rico or USVI from the continental United States is distance, and the tyranny of distance will compromise time. And so how do we overcome that? And the answer is through readiness and preparedness infrastructure, not unlike the infrastructure in place for sheltering. And so you have to have the necessary people available. And it's not just employees. It's volunteers, it's the community, and it's people in community. And this is not a punch or a promo for the American Red Cross. There's all sorts of organizations that volunteer to operate, and we need all of them to work in different mission space. And so building a strong volunteer base on the island is going to be very, very important. We have volunteers who are already coming back, who are working now on the island, and my goal would be that rather than having 90% of the Red Cross forces on island be deployed from the continental United States, I'd like to see 90% coming from the community and 10% coming from the United States to support, continental United States to support and assist. That makes for a stronger, more resilient operation. Number 2, necessary supplies available. There were supplies on the island, and we did have, there was a food supply and a water supply, but it's clear now that there are additional supplies that may be necessary. The challenge in that calculus is, how often are you going to have an Irma, a Maria? How often does that happen, and can you afford the investment? So there's a balance that has to be made there, like many of the other balances you've talked about, but I think it's important to realize that people do need portable generators. We know that's going to be a need given the situation, so let's not try to bring them in by barge. Maybe there's a reason to warehouse that. If you're going to build a warehouse to store emergency materials and emergency relief supplies, maybe it shouldn't be in a flood zone. And that's a real consideration. So then you get to the next piece of this is distribution. You've heard every member of this panel talk about distribution. Reestablishing a distribution network in the aftermath of a hurricane or a major event is a challenge anywhere in the world, and so nobody should be surprised when it's a challenge here. So are there enough high-profile vehicles that can get through floodwaters? Are there the right vehicles that allow you to negotiate mountainous terrain, and they can't have been destroyed by the surge, the wind, or the flood, which are the threats that come from this type of event? So necessary people, necessary supplies. The third thing is infrastructure, and I mean that in a different way than you're going to hear it from other panelists. I'm talking about the infrastructure of emergency management. So can you communicate? Do you have emergency communications? Can you connect all 78 municipalities, and you can do it every time right away, regardless of what happens to the grid? If you're reliant on one system, one organization, that is a single point of failure, and look what happens, it fails. So I think that infrastructure of the emergency management structure on the island is critical. And again, it is the federal government, it is the Commonwealth government, it is private sector, it is volunteer organizations. As you heard my colleague from DHS say, FEMA is a coordinating structure. If you don't have anything to coordinate, then you shouldn't expect that it's going to be successful. So that infrastructure is what I'm talking about there. And then last but not least is you've got to have a supportive community. If you're exchanging business cards in a disaster, it's too late. So those relationships are important, and they need to be established pre-event. I don't want to sound like I'm making plugs for my colleagues at FEMA, but the federal coordinating officer, who is the president's designee coordinating relief operations on the ground, has a great relationship with the Puerto Rican Emergency Management Association and with the governor. And it's because of that that we've been able to make, as an emergency management community, the progress that we've made. So I think that those are the four elements as you talk about rebuilding from an emergency management perspective. What do we need to consider? Necessary people, are they available? Are we building the capacity? Necessary supplies, available, building capacity. Is it sustainable? Can they be distributed? Is the necessary infrastructure in place for the emergency management community? And last but not least, have you built a supportive community in all sectors that can respond and recover? It goes to the point you heard earlier real quick. The very people who are responding to this are people who have been victimized by it. It's happened with the police force, the fire force, the medical force, the National Guard, volunteers, and so we've had to bring people in from off island to do that. So I think the goal needs to be, let's get those people back to wherever they came from. Let's help the island stay intact and be able to build its resilience and support that, rather than creating a diaspora that probably isn't going to be commercially viable or, from a humanitarian perspective, desirable in any way, shape, or form, because of just the extreme pain and suffering that kind of diaspora causes everyone. So thank you.
Thank you, Brad. Jonathan, do you have any other remarks?
No, not really, because he's much more of an operator than I am, so I will defer to him on the operational challenges. I do agree that the time factor is probably the most important, as you can never get that back. All the other stuff, we can get more supplies, we can get more money, we can get all the other stuff, but the time is the issue. And in a lot of cases, things were done properly to have the supplies there, to have the equipment there, to be leaning forward. I mean, FEMA and the Red Cross were on the ground for 50 days, basically. I mean, they've been there before Irma hit, they were there after, they've been there before Maria hit. So people were there and prepared. But what happened is, when the distribution system failed, it just increased the time to get things to people. And that was difficult to overcome. And so you can plan for things like that, but you just have to be able to move quickly. And to the other point is the sense of community. Your neighbors are going to be able to help you far sooner than anybody else can. So go back to Texas. Neighbors in John boats picking up neighbors from houses and taking them out of the floodwaters. I think the Coast Guard, roughly 50-something thousand rescues by air of people trapped in houses in Texas. Neighbors in John boats, I think it's probably a multiple of that number. Friends helping friends, neighbors helping neighbors. And that's part of the thing is in Puerto Rico, is that the devastation was so widespread, was so complete across the island, is that it was difficult for those community members to help each other, and thus had to rely on other people coming onto the island, and that took time. In other states, you can drive trucks into Houston, you can drive trucks into East Texas. We had a ship getting from Tampa to Key West is a few hours. That gets back to that time, and the people who can respond the quickest are going to be your neighbors, the mayors, the governors, and then the federal government. So you always want to focus on the people closest who can get there the fastest.
Thank you. I'm not sure if any of the panelists want to make any
Yes.
comments.
In terms of how can we avoid, or how can we try to help in terms of being more fast, more prepared, and be ready in the next event. We will have the next event because we are in the middle of the Caribbean, as President Trump says, right? I think everybody knows that we're an island after his comments, surrounded by water, a lot of water, ocean water. But the most important element that we have to cure is energy. The things that could help us in being ready and minimizing damages is to have a robust, strong, modern electrical grid with a lot of private generation, a diversified ways of generating, transmitting, and distributing the energy. We, in order to be independent of all these fatalities, we need to control that. The Puerto Rico Power Authority biggest asset is their human resources. There are many capable people there that could help us in terms of putting all this together and modernizing our grid based on a strong regulatory framework, audit by a strong regulatory entity. That's the only way we are going to help Puerto Rico to control damages in the future. Thank you.
I'd like to add something very quickly. I'd like to talk about building codes as well. In 2011, Puerto Rico adopted what at the time was cutting-edge building codes, expecting that 145 mile per hour winds will never actually hit the island. We have stronger storms nowadays. I don't want to get into that issue and why, but that's a fact of life. So, and actually, there are new building codes that have come out internationally after 2011. So I would say we need to look into that. Secondly, and actually David alluded to it briefly, even though any construction built according to those codes, building codes, was able to withstand the winds and everything else, if you allow informal construction to occur, and if you allow the building in a flood area, you're going to have a problem again. And hopefully this will be used as an opportunity to try to avoid those two flaws.
Thank you. I think we can now turn into the longer, did you want to? Yes, sorry.
I didn't say it at the beginning just because we had, but metrics are important in numbers, and I think we've been hearing some magnitudes, but the last report out yesterday, government, federal, local, and some private sector vetting, just so we have an idea of what's going on the ground. And they're not in any order, unfortunately, so just bear with me. So gasoline stations, we understand, are 77% open. And just so you have a sense, that's 837 out of 1,100 gasolines on the island. Supermarkets, 70% open. That's 318 out of 456. And this is with all caveats. Doesn't mean 24-hour operation. It doesn't mean full power. It doesn't mean they can take credit cards. I mean, with challenges, but at least we're getting there. Power Authority, as we've seen, 8%. Water, surprisingly, 48%. And it's got an interesting breakdown. 55. Thank you, Governor. Interesting breakdown. On the metropolitan area, 63%. The northern area, which is where Maria exited, Arecibo and those areas, 14. The west, which was least damaged, 30%. South, 77. And this surprises me, but entry point was the east, 45% with water. I had people who told me 2 days after I had water. So, the water situation is a bit tricky one. Telecom, overall, 43%, but cellular antennas, 12%. 312 out of 2,700. So that's a challenge. And cellular towers, if you're in that business, they're two separate things. The antenna is one thing, the tower is another, at 22%, 365 out of 1,600. So there you begin challenge. You mentioned the shelters and how many people, and just another good piece, pharmacies at 60% operation, 462. Ports, that's been the good story. I think the port people told us the port was good. Cranes weren't damaged, everything was there, but containers at about 75% because they can't move them. So everything was there, but it's a logistic issues. Banks at 153, but again, challenge on getting access, and matching that ATM machines, 36%. And that again is power and electronics and so on, 430 out of 1,100. And bus routes at 75%. And the airport, as you all know, is now 100% commercial. But we had, at the beginning, 8 commercial flights a day. And when we were told what was happening, 5 to 10 hour turnaround because there weren't people at the airport and there wasn't a capacity to turn around a plane. And with or without, regulations. You can't just take a plane from anywhere in the U.S. and land it somewhere else without everybody prepping that up, as you all know. So just to get some data so we have a sense, and obviously we can be monitoring this as time goes on. Well, no, I didn't have it, but I understand the governor said yesterday 34 and growing. And if you're interested, the website for this is status.pr/home, and it's usually updated about daily. So you can all just track that. So I just want to put that there so people can use that resource. Thank you, Romina.
Okay, I think, Brad, you wanted to just...
30 seconds to tie the pieces together real quick. So the American Radio Relay League was deployed to Puerto Rico. There were trucks that we brought in, the collective we with FEMA and others, with VSAT, which is satellite communications, and those folks have driven all over the island. They have ham radios, and so they get into a community. People are able to register either through Google or Safe and Well or any of the systems for reunification. One of the biggest demand signals we see is folks come into those trucks and are like, hey, I just want to communicate with my relatives back in the States. I want to let people know that I'm okay because of that communications piece of it. And so there's all kinds of ways to work around. The other thing is, just to share about that, FEMA in the last week has provided sat phones to every single mayor and every municipality, and they have connected all of that network together. All of that is ways to, again, just deal with the fact that communications and power may be limiting factors. That doesn't mean they can't be overcome in the near term to build stability, and that's happening.
Thank you. I'd like to move on now, 15 to 20 minutes of discussion on the third topic, which is, I think, the most crucial topic in this conversation about the future. I'm going to deviate a little bit with a question, but I'd like to call on Rodrigo and David. If you were tasked to prepare a development strategy for Puerto Rico for the next 15 years, what would that entail? What would be the elements?
Well, I think I'm more concerned for the development status of the next 6 months, because if we don't take care of this, again, we are going to have an economic catastrophe and a social catastrophe. So I will get back into what Governor Fortuño mentioned this morning, that is critical that we get in agreement with the bondholders in order to get Puerto Rico out of that scenario. And whatever they agree to, it's important to have it as soon as possible in order to jump that obstacle. Second, if we don't get our economic sector up and running, there's not going to be long term. We need to get them up and running. For example, I mentioned the timing of this hurricane in terms of the school season. My son's school loses 200 kids in a couple of weeks. If they don't open, they will bankrupt because most of those kids will be relocated. So now I heard this morning that Sol Maria in Fajardo is closing their doors. There you have many people unemployed. Those people are again part of the productive labor force. They will take a flight and they will relocate. So we have to, in one area, take care of the economic reconstruction in terms of the high caliber subjects like the debt. And then in the other, take care of moving on in terms of letting businesses receive their fuel and start up operations before it's too late. So in terms of economic development, Romina, we have many plans, and Governor Fortuño has been part of most of them. And most of those plans are based on manufacturing development, in export of services, in being the hub of the Caribbean in many senses, and being part of the keeping America great, okay? But in order to go into that area, we need to be able to kind of step on the ladder the next two or three steps. So that's my thought.
Thank you, Romina. Earlier, the governor mentioned that the most challenging task when you're in public service is actually execution and implementation. Puerto Rico has been overstudied and reported on for 100 years. I'm privileged that my father came to Puerto Rico to do that, started that with people that were brought by Governor Luis Muñoz Marin in 1950, the creme de la creme of international development, people that transformed Puerto Rico from the lowest GDP in the entire Caribbean to an industrial powerhouse, a GDP of $100 billion. And everything has been studied and reviewed, and up to 2 years ago with Promesa, the Kruger report, and so on. And for those people who are in that business, you'll notice one similarity. It's all the same things over and over with different authors. Nobel Prize winner, Tobin, whoever, Krebs, Kruger, it's the same thing. And our weakness has been execution. And the weakness in the execution has been because neither side blinks. And the two sides are the federal supervisory government and the local state government. And when neither side blinks, you're just there, and what happens with the reports? They all just get studied away. We've got wonderful educational research centers, and people just studying more and more. And our problem is execution. Now the problem is you're going to have to execute whatever it takes at whatever cost. And as Rodrigo mentions, we're going to have to walk, chew gum, dance, cook, and clean up all at the same time, whether we like it or not. And it can be done. It's been done in South Asia when you've had tsunamis and you've had typhoons. It's been done. It's just a matter of now people just going to have to say, okay, this is how it's going to be. And to a certain degree, it's going to have to take a bit of, executive decision. I don't care. It's in my mandate. This is what we're going to do. And because, we sit down and we discuss it, and we're going to be here 6 years from now with some other legislation in Congress. And so that's going to involve, and then, of course, our friends on the Hill, which unfortunately we weren't able to secure for today, but we promise you all we will get someone from the Hill eventually, because everything happening with Puerto Rico on the fiscal debt, Promesa, and so on, is mandated and run and controlled by federal law. So this is not Mr. Mnuchin anymore. This is not Mr. Trump anymore. This is not Mr. Liu anymore. This is law of the land. The only way you change law of the land is with another law. And that's one of the challenges that's going to have to come. And everybody's going to have to take a cut. Some are volunteering it. So, that's going to be there. And I think the key one is the overarching infrastructure. Rodrigo has mentioned the name, PREPA, but it's in general the fact that we do not have a open market competitive economy anywhere in Puerto Rico. My pet peeve, education. Over the past decade, we have had 25% decline in student enrollment K to 12th grade in the public sector. Show of hands, what do you think has happened with the public sector education budget in the same period? How many think it went up? Just show of hands. How many people think it went down? Okay. It went up. Do you know by how much? 25% decline in enrollment, public sector budget went up 35%. That's management. That's administrators. That's not school teachers and so on. So again, that's something we can handle in Puerto Rico. It's just a matter of doing it. And you can go through every sector of the economy and you will see that. The main challenge happening now, you're reading about major corporations leaving Catalonia to set up shop in another part of Spain. Why? Because they think something bad is going to happen and they can't operate out of Catalonia anymore. Well, we have a risk that major corporations who employ a lot of people may say, you know what? I need to hit Texas. I need to hit Houston. I may even need to hit the Dominican Republic. Why? Because I can't operate in Puerto Rico anymore. And that's an emergency situation in terms of economic strategy. And we need to get our hands around that. And that involves public policy, but it also involves just executing and sitting down and saying, what do you need so you can operate? Otherwise, as unfortunately with Vision, Governor Scott has decided to do in Florida, he is planning for 100,000 minimum Puerto Ricans to arrive in Florida before the end of the year. He doesn't like it. He doesn't want to promote it, but he knows it's a reality. And as opposed to Haitian immigrants and Cubans, you don't have any Marines who can control them. They just get on the plane, come out. So he's now set up 4 airports in Florida to receive Puerto Ricans arriving, housing, schooling, health, education, and he's declared it a state of emergency. And, you know, it's a free market. We're all American citizens. We can pick up and go wherever we want, whenever we want. So somebody has to start focusing on that as part of the general problem. Otherwise, those assets are going to be lost. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe, Governor, would you like to say some final words, and then I'll open up the floor for Q&A.
Sure. We are focused on what we ought to be focusing right now, and that it's helping those in dire straits at the present moment. But there'll be a time where when we need to focus on what's going to happen next. I think some of the panelists have alluded to that. I'd like to add a couple of things. Infrastructure in Puerto Rico has suffered severe damage in some areas and not so much in other areas. There'll be insurance money coming in, and there'll be FEMA money coming in. How can those funds be leveraged in a way that you don't simply rebuild your 1950s infrastructure, but you think about what ought to be there in the 21st century? And the only way I see it is with private sector participation. Puerto Rico has state-of-the-art public-private partnership legislation. It has a good track record. The law has been dormant for 5 years, but the current administration in Puerto Rico, and as David was saying, a lot of these things should be handled locally, has said that they want to move on P3s. This is an opportunity to do exactly that. But execution, of course, will be a challenge. Secondly, any regulatory constraints, locally and federally, ought to be, this is an opportunity to look at them. I have sensed a desire at the federal level to think out of the box in terms of infrastructure development, as well as in terms of regulatory reviews. But that also has to happen at the local level, I would say. And thirdly, it is an opportunity to do things right, to move from a situation where there is too much state control to a situation where there is state control. I am leaving an example that doesn't go well with a lot of people. And that's why I'm working in Washington. But anyhow, but bottom line here is that it ought to happen. We don't have a choice. The alternative is much worse.
Thank you, Governor. I'd like to maybe now open the floor for a few questions. We have about, let's say, 15 minutes. So, yes, let's take the gentleman here, the lady over there, 2 questions, and then, yes. And please, can you identify yourself and your affiliation?
My name is Peter Selmer. I'm the Chief Executive Editor and owner of Capital Intelligence Group. I just came back from Puerto Rico. I was there from Sunday. I was with the President of the United States Tuesday morning. I can report that things are going extremely well. This is military. They can do this in their sleep. They know exactly what they need to do on power. San Juan Airport is working better than LaGuardia or JFK at this moment. I'm not joking. You got private sector business. I was at Pfizer in Barceloneta. My question is first to Governor Fortuno and then to Mr. Maez Arce as private sector. While you were governor of Puerto Rico, those who invested in Puerto Rican bonds, those in Wall Street and AMBAC, knew that their investment was irresponsible and unsustainable. PREPA was never worth $9 billion. Now it should be zeroed out, force majeure, and we start by scratch, hopefully with Exelon and maybe the Italian operator Enel, who are the best in the business in this. The second question is, can we get the 936? That was the cause of all this decline in Puerto Rico when they got rid of the Section 936. And we see good leadership from some private sector leaders in Puerto Rico. We do not see some. The airline CEOs are not running the airport as they are. We need more CEOs. AT&T, despite that, should have all these towers operating. We need Randall Stevenson in Puerto Rico today. And we're seeing good leadership from the private sector. Everything private sector with leadership is working well. So Puerto Rico is working. I've never seen a disaster that's coming in as clearly focused with the U.S. military. Buchanan's taking over. Our soldiers are doing a great job. They know exactly what they're doing. I just wanted to get that from Fortuna about AMBAC and
Okay.
the obligations.
That's one, the lady here, please.
Thank you. Leslie Casey, U.S. citizen. I'd like to speak to the future. I appreciate everyone is wrapped up in the recovery. However, the future and the long-term sustainability, I would suggest that it would be valuable to designate Puerto Rico, the full island, as a national park. This would enable more people to recognize it as part of the United States. I also think that it would also help in the drafting of the bill for the debt forgiveness, because I think most people can understand that, okay, you're going to forgive the debt, but what's the future? What are we building? And most people understand the national parks. Puerto Rico is a national treasure, a paradise that everyone would like to visit.
Okay.
And so we would
Okay.
like to suggest that Puerto Rico be a national park and be part of the
Okay.
debt restructuring.
Thank you for that. Any reactions to those two questions?
Well, let me go over. The airport is functioning much better. That is true. I was there this weekend. It's being run privately, and in that sense, I was alluding to the need for more private sector participation in some of the areas that historically have been in the hands of government. It's not easy to execute that, but I believe the time is right for that. And we have the proper legal framework in the P3 legislation that Puerto Rico has, but the law has been dormant for 5 years. So it's going to be used, and it's going to be used properly, and I certainly hope it will. In terms of, and I think David alluded to this, in terms of the debt situation, Congress already legislated on this. Congress decided that there is a process. If that's going to be changed, it cannot be changed by executive fiat. The law has to be changed. I'm not privy to the negotiations between creditors and debtors because I don't represent any of them, so I don't know what's going on there. But all I can tell you is that the law would have to be changed to what both have alluded to so far. And there was a third question about. I think that. Bringing back the 936. Let me tell you, if you look at the economic data, the truth of the matter is that Puerto Rico's economic demise commenced with the free trade agreements. I'm not here to talk about against free trade, I'm just telling you what happened. And we have to base ourselves on facts, not on what other people repeat all the time. The free trade agreements caused a dramatic dislocation because Puerto Rico historically had actually almost exclusive access to the mainland market. And that was gone with NAFTA, CAFTA-DR, and the other free trade agreements. And Puerto Rico could not adjust. We can later on devote days to discuss why that did not adjust. But that was the caused enormous dislocation economically. Then, of course, the tax advantages that you are mentioning did not help in that situation at all. But I would say that this actually presents an opportunity also for policymakers in Washington to look at this holistically and think about it, because Puerto Rico is not the only part of the country that has been affected in the last 20, 30 years by federal policy that may work well for some parts of the country, but not so well for other parts of the country. And hopefully that opportunity will be coming soon.
Yes, thank you. Puerto Rico employees and employers are USA employees and employers. Puerto Rico is USA. So every competitive differential that we may design in order to develop our economy is important. Okay, I would love to have 936 backs. Okay, nevertheless, in line of what Governor Fortuño just mentioned, it is important to work into a new ecosystem that helps Puerto Rico to be competitive against Ireland, against Guatemala, Costa Rica, against Singapore, against any other jurisdiction where multinationals are located. So yes, we have been working with that, and we will keep working in terms of defining a better ecosystem for our employers. I want to clarify, and I think you're right in terms of the federal government and the state government are making a great job. There's no doubt about that. Proportionally speaking, there's progress, but there's still many things to approach and to accomplish. There's many people dying because of lack of energy. Basically, again, we go back to power. There's babies in nursery rooms of hospitals that are dying because of that. Even though Brad mentioned in the other room that dialysis people are well kept, if they don't have power, they can receive the treatment. So even though the death toll is 3.6, we may be falling into a different numbers when we take into accountability the indirect causes, the indirect effects of not having the right energy grid. And supporting Governor Fortunio Diaz have to open a new era for private generation, transmission, and distribution.
Thank you. There's a question here, and maybe we'll take a question from the lady in the back. Can you please identify yourself?
Yeah, good morning. Thank you all for coming. My name is Vadim Nicotine. We've been in business in Puerto Rico for 40 years. I grew up there. We have 35 commercial properties. One of them has power today. I don't necessarily agree with what this gentleman said because I was there this weekend and there were not visibly containers moving and Army personnel moving anywhere in the 6 towns where I was for 7 hours on a motorcycle. So there's still a lot to do. There's a lot being done, but it's not visible, and the frustration of the people is unbelievable. My question to all of you is regarding infrastructure. We had a phone call yesterday with the Aqueduct and Sewer Authority, one of our friends, and he said that they estimate about $1.4 billion worth of repairs needed to the aqueduct system, which means drinking water for the 50% or so that don't have it, as well as the sewer system. In Puerto Rico, on average, we have about $300 million worth of capacity from contractors to rebuild things on an annual basis. We have the talent, but we don't have the capacity. So what do we do to get that extra $1 billion worth of construction capacity on the island so we can get the water infrastructure back in gear within a reasonable amount of time and not 5 years from now?
Thank you. And I'll take one more question from the lady in the back.
Good morning. My name is Dr. Minerva Diaz. I grew up in the island. I grew up in Rincon, which is on the western side. Today I'm here on behalf of those who are literally dying on the ground. I have received lots of requests for emergency transport from Puerto Rico on medical reasons, and I would like to know who, what, when, and who do I need to contact, when, how, any system set up for those that need emergency evacs out of Puerto Rico.
Okay. Maybe we can take that last question first and then. Yeah.
So the emergency evacuation process right now is what you would expect, which is that if you've got a medical emergency and it genuinely requires evacuation and it can't be treated on the island, then that's arranged through the normal medical evacuation system, which is being coordinated now through the Joint Field Office on the ground, Health and Human Services, which is in the world of response, Emergency Support Function 8. There's 15 functions that perform this. So Health and Human Services has the federal angle of it, but at the local and municipal and level, hospitals are evaluating their patients and they're referring as necessary for off-island evac. I can give you point of contact. I'm happy to do that when we're done here so that you can reach out and get some help. to do that. But my understanding, based on the communications I've had, and defer to DHS if they have a different view of this, is that the Federal Department of Health and Human Services, through their representatives and their folks who are at the Joint Field Office, are coordinating with both public and private hospitals to ensure that evacuation is occurring. I can tell you this, I've got 97 dialysis patients who were evacuated in various hospitals and facilities in Atlanta, Georgia right now that we're providing services to every day, and that's for a sustained period of time. So it's happening. So I'll get you some points of contact so we can make sure your folks are taken care of. There's nothing more important.
And I would just add that with the hospitals, right now generator power is available at all of the hospitals, I think, except for one that closed for other reasons. 14 of the hospitals are on the electrical grid right now. The way it is set up is that FEMA and HHS, as Brad mentioned, have set up kind of a three-tier structure there, and they have the medical center in San Juan as kind of the critical care structure facility that they're trying to get people to. And then secondly, they're supporting the existing hospitals that are open and working, trying to get them, make sure they have supplies, make sure they have everything they need. And then third, they're actually doing pop-up hospitals. They've got 2 or 3 pop-up hospitals that they've put together that are staffed by DOD, HHS, and other medical professionals. Believe they're expecting to do a couple more of those. And then additionally, the USNS Comfort showed up a couple days ago. That has about 800 medical professionals on it. So the process is we've been in contact, we have communications with all of those hospitals. They're able to report back to the JFO and arrange evacs. As I said yesterday, I think they had 29 people evac from one hospital that was having power problems, and getting them to the Comfort. Additionally, they're doing evac flights for people who need to get into Atlanta, Miami, or wherever they need to go for treatment. So there's a process in place. It's working. It's probably not moving as fast as people would like on the ground, but the expectation is we've got the people there, we've got the supplies there, we've got the power there to help those hospitals run and operate effectively for now, as we try to get to a better situation where those people are in a better place to be cared for. But please, let Brad or I know. We can get you the right contact from HHS. Dr. Cadlick, I know, is on the ground from HHS and is running the emergency, the ESF-8 function down there. So we can definitely take a look at that.
Okay, thank you. And Vadim's question on infrastructure.
I think his question is right on point, and I think there are a number of challenges here. One has to do with adequate insurance for the different properties, and it depends. I have a question on Prasa. What kind of insurance do they have, and what kind of financial capacities do they have? And if I don't know the answer, but I'll take a guess, and I think it's an educated guess. I don't think insurance plus FEMA will equal, is it 1.5 billion? $1.4 billion. I may be wrong, but I don't think it will equal $1.4 billion. That's why I believe the only way to get where we need to get to is leverage that money. And in order to leverage that money, you need the private sector involvement. Whether, I don't know if it's the creditors or whether it's a third party and the judge, under Promesa takes care of that. I'm not going to get into that. But one way or another, that's the only way to get to the 1.4. And this will repeat itself in other areas. Secondly, then, the bonding capacity, because you're talking about the bonding capacity of the construction companies and how far they can go. Well, hopefully there'll be construction companies here that are interested in partnering with local companies in doing this. I will wrap the deal so that the bonding capacity will be there. The question is there too much work in Texas and Florida right now, and it's more attractive to stay in the mainland as opposed to go to the USVI in Puerto Rico? I don't know. Then we may have to look elsewhere. Is it, I don't know, Chinese construction companies? Is it, I don't have the answer, but that's a second real challenge that you're bringing up. But without the first one being answered, we don't even get to the second one.
Well, the governor answered it. I mean, he didn't get into the specifics, but he did answer it. The way that we go into that kind of investments, being creative, and the private sector have to kind of look the ways in order to design the proper solution. But if, for example, the people who are the owners of the debt does not move forward and create something interesting that could get into those subjects and react and solve that kind of challenge, then again, there's not going to be anything to collect. So Governor Fortunio is right on target. There have to be creativity in terms of designing how financially we're going to approach these challenges.
Sorry, we run out of time, so I want to thank everybody for coming, and especially our distinguished panelists, and there's going to be more discussions to come. Thank you.